Welcome back. You're watching The Fix with me, Karima Brahman. I'm in conversation with Paulo Jordan and Dr. Oscar van Heerden on the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggle against racism. Paulo, before the break, Oscar was saying that he thinks that the struggle against racism and colonialism needs to be upped in substance, and that getting tangled up in getting statues of historical figures removed is in some ways a diversion. Do you agree, for example, particularly let's bring it home to South Africa? I mean, if one walks in a place like Cape Town, you can literally track the colonial history by way of the statues if one starts at the parade. What is your take on statues having to come down, particularly, let's say, in the South African context and even in the British context where there's a push now around Winston Churchill?
Well, statues symbolize honoring people. So when you erect a statue, for example, of Queen Victoria in the grounds of South Africa's parliament, it was to honor Queen Victoria. When you erect a statue to Jan van Riebeeck on the foreshore in Cape Town, it's to honor Jan van Riebeeck. So symbolically, it is important to bring it down because they'll say, this is a dishonorable person. He does not deserve to be honored in this way. Now, to be sure, it doesn't make a difference in terms of what wage someone is going to be paid the next day. It doesn't make a difference in terms of whether you're going to be living in informal settlements or informal housing the next day. It doesn't, to be sure. And the substance of the struggle against racism should be to improve the quality of people's lives. But the symbolic significance of bringing down a statue is a very important message. I wouldn't have gone as far as the kids at UCT and throw feces on Rose's statue, but I wouldn't mourn that either.
Now, I mean, the question around statues and, of course, the content of a struggle is important. And I must say my view is that you can do both. It's not kind of either or. But let's bring it down to the way in which we record history, the way in which we remember, particularly in the South African context, and rendering communities visible. In South Africa, we still have very huge categories of race. We talk about Africans in particular, blacks in general. Paulo, you spoke about what an African is. The ANC has categories of people that don't categorize someone like myself as an African. What is an African in particular?
No. We have to deal with the realities of South Africa. The fact of the matter is that racism, colonialism, and apartheid, and all systems of colonialism have been hierarchies. And in South Africa during the 1930s, there was a debate in the African language press about what we should call ourselves. And whereas in the past, people used to refer to themselves as Kaffirs, as natives, as Bantus, it was agreed that we would use the term African. Now, the other black groups, Asian and colored, didn't adopt that. So when the term African has been used since the 1930s, it refers specifically to people who are indigenously African, descended from the Negroid races of Africa. Now, of course, people who are colored, so-called, are descended from a mix of everything. And they are very indigenous to South Africa in that respect. Equally, since 1860, millions or thousands of people of Indian descent have also become indigenous to South Africa. But remembering that there was that hierarchy in which people of European descent were at the top and those of African descent were at the bottom, we can't ignore that reality. So when the ANC says liberation of blacks in general, Africans in particular, it's referring to the specific conditions of South Africa in which the Africans were at the bottom of the pyramid.
But now, why can't people, Palo, why can't people have multiple identities? The African National Congress also accepted that people who have relatives and descendants and ancestors who are born on the continent are Africans. Why 25 years into democracy do we still talk about Africans in particular, as if other groups in South Africa are not African? Because it does feel as if this title is reserved for some.
Well, it has to be reserved for some, given our history. At the same time, too, there is the aspiration, as enunciated in Thabo Mbeki's famous "I'm an African" speech, that everyone should be African. What we aspire to is a situation like you have in Mexico, where a person who's blonde, white, looks like he got off the ship yesterday with Cortez, identifies completely with Mexico, and not utter a word in defense of the Spanish conquistadors. That's what we want to have here in South Africa. We don't have that yet, which is why the issue of statues is so important. I used to say a couple of years back that if someone came here from outer space and looked at these statues in South Africa, you gain the impression that the Europeans were here first, because all the statues commemorate Europeans. We have a couple now, Mandela here, Lutuli there, Tambo there, Sobukwe there, Biko there. But otherwise, the landscape is dominated by figures of people of European descent, the colonized and the oppressors.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, Palo, but there's a lot of communities that are also not rendered visible. Oscar, do you agree that African in particular should refer to that narrow category that Palo has placed in its historic context today still?
Well, I think the first thing, Karima, is that we are indeed all South Africans. Post-1994. I think the historical context is important that Palo is referring to. It's important to the extent that as we try and unpick apartheid legacy within South Africa, it is unfortunate that we still have to subscribe to apartheid classifications of Indians, colored, so-called, and African. But as you want to measure or gauge whether you are making progress, I think we will all agree historically the very most oppressed and exploited within our society has been the Black African. And it was used as a tool of divide and rule by the apartheid regime to say that give a little more to the colored, give a little more to the Indian, so that there can be resentment amongst the blacks. And so if you want to then unpack apartheid, gauge whether you are making progress, whether it is in housing, electricity provision, basic services, and so forth. Unfortunately, there is still this measure, this classification of, are we actually uplifting that segment of society that was most oppressed and exploited, which was the Black African? And I think in that context, I don't have an issue with it. But I do agree with you that at the end of the day, post-1994, we are all South Africans, indeed Africans, because we are from the continent, and that there is a number of ethnicities in the context of South Africa, those being Xhosas, Zulus, of course those of Indian descent, and indeed mixed race groupings such as the so-called colored, which is a classification that came in 1904 by the apartheid and colonial powers.
Palo, let me bring you in here. This question of reserving African and Black African for very specific groups of people has caused resentment amongst those who have historically been oppressed. People feel that they are not allowed to honor their African roots, particularly people who come from a slave background, who come from a very rich, melange of histories, whether it is slaves that were brought here from the rest of the continent, from other parts of the world as a result of the Dutch and everyone else. And then, of course, the actual intermarriages that happened here. And then, before groups of people descended from the rest of the continent down at the southern tip, there were, of course, First Peoples here. And if one talks about statues and so on, one can very well ask, where is the statues of the First Peoples, the people who were actually here at the most southern tip of Africa? So to what extent does these exclusive with categories take us to a history that actually honors the past in a way that is more accurate, but also gives us the tools to navigate a future that is not ahistorical, but also more inclusive?
If we excluded the First Nations of South Africa, that is the Khoi and the San people, from the category African, what has happened has been the tendency on the part of the descendants of those people not to want to identify themselves as African because of the hierarchy I referred to. Equally also, no one has ever wanted to exclude the people who are of mixed descent, referred to generally as colored, from the category African, but most colors don't want to be referred to as Africans. They'll even say, I'm a South African. But if you say, oh, you're an African, they say, no, I'm not an African. I'm a South African, but I'm a colored. Now, those are problems which are the result of that hierarchy. You don't want to be identified with that bottom rung in the ladder. Now, that is a sociological problem. What we aspire to, as I said, is a situation in which everyone who comes from the country identifies as South African and identifies with the African continent. Like I said, a Mexican who is blonde, blue-eyed, and looks like he came off the ship yesterday with Pizarro identifies with Mexico and not with the conquistadors. That's what we want to see in South Africa. How you reach that is not by pretending the past does not exist. It is by wrestling with that past and uprooting those attitudes that lead to a situation in which the First Nations are denied.
Oscar, how does one navigate the struggle against racism in a place like South Africa, where you have a majority black government, where you still have black, poor South Africans facing the brunt end of the stick, whether it is law enforcement, whether it's people dying as a result of police brutality, army brutality, as we've seen in the case of Collins Khoza? How do you navigate that struggle? Because a lot of people take offense when you want to talk about someone like Collins Khoza, who died at the hands of black, South Africans, in the context of a black majority democratic government, in the context of Black Lives Matter. How does one bring class elements to that struggle against racism?
Yeah, so as you know, I think firstly just to say that I think the Khoi and the San debate is a very interesting one, because it does put front and center the issue about Africans in particular, because they of course feel that they are as African as it gets. So I think that's an important debate that must be had. But to answer your question, Karima, there are broadly two categories or areas that deals with racism. The one is of course race theory, which is what me and you and Hello has been talking about by and large. But then there's also the issue of power relations. And this is to come to your question. Unlike the African American in the United States, who is indeed a minority and doesn't have political power in that country, we, on the other hand, as black South Africans, do have political power. We do have the power to determine our destiny. And so it becomes very difficult to hear people talking, for example, in the context of private schools and Model C schools, where black students are referring to themselves as minorities, when in fact they are part of the black majority, they have political power, and they need to own that. Our guideline, of course, is the Constitution of the Republic, which is vehemently anti-racist. And so we determine our future as a black majority in South Africa, having political power, and indeed can dictate the narrative of race theory in this country. Hence, we are discussing what constitutes African, what is actually black in general, and black Africans in particular, and so on and so forth. So I think that the still have a long journey to go. The comparisons of, for example, the murder of George Floyd and indeed the murder of Collins Khoza, I think it is unfortunate to the extent that clearly the American example is a grouping within law enforcement that is racist that is profiling, racist profiling, and targeting of black men, whereas in the South African context, it is negligence, it is competence, it is attitude, but it can't necessarily fall in the category of racism geared towards a particular grouping within South Africa. However, Karima, you would agree that we have that history within our security forces. We have that mentality within our security forces coming from a very racist past.
All right, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Of course, a lot of interesting conversations still to be had on this matter, and I'm sure that, it is conversations that need to be had, particularly around what constitutes an African and whether we're going to continue to cling to these exclusive titles as we try and forge an anti-racist society in the country. Thank you so much to Paulo Jordan as well as Dr. Oscar van Heerden. Now, the devastation in the economy in South Africa as a result of COVID-19 is, of course, sharply felt by small businesses. We're going to come to that in a short while. Let's take a break. When we come back, we will be speaking with John Dludlu.